a favor and just keep your cameras and your microphones turned off for the presentation. There still is a way for you to ask questions. You're going to be looking for the button around the periphery of your screen. For me, it's at the top of my screen. If you go all the way to the right where it says more, there is your chat feature to select. You can ask questions at any time during the meeting or the presentation. And if there are questions that pertain to our feature presentation, we're going to hold the questions till the end and then address them after the presentation is over. And as I mentioned, we are recording the meeting tonight so that anybody who could not attend the meeting live will have the opportunity to watch the recording. That'll be available through a link in our newsletter and on our website. But the only two people that you'll be seeing in the recording would either be myself or Chad Washburn, our speaker for tonight. Okay, so I have two quick polls. Really, it's one poll that I put together that has two questions. And it's just to get to know the audience a little bit. So you should be able to see the poll questions right now. One of them, are you a Naples chapter member or a guest with us tonight? So you can go ahead and answer that. I'm also wondering if you've heard about the new Lunch and Learn webinar series that's been happening on Fridays. That's available to Florida Native Plant Society members. I'll give everybody a few more seconds to answer those questions. Okay, looks like most people have voted now. 90% have voted. So I'll go ahead and end the poll so we can see what everybody said. Looks like we're about 50-50 for people who are members of the Naples chapter and people who are attending as guests, so that's really great. We always love when new people come to the meetings and show an interest in our topics and presentations. And then for the Lunch and Learn webinars, it's again kind of roughly 50-50. Some of you have heard about it, some of you have not. But if you do, if you're not a member yet and you do decide to join, go ahead and close the poll so I can see the slide. If you visit our website, fnpsnaples.org, at the top of our website, there's a button that says Join Us, and that'll take you to the membership page for the Florida Native Plant Society. And the memberships are very reasonable, starts at $35 a year for an individual, and even less than that for full-time students, $15 a year. So it's a really great way to support the Naples chapter and the society so we can keep bringing you programs like this. Okay, next thing in my announcements, as you've probably noticed, we have a new chapter logo. So that's the one at the top right of the screen with the two water lilies as part of the logo. And if you were with us back in December, we had a discussion at our meeting about kind of redesigning the logo for the Naples chapter. We had 3 different options, and the water lily option was the most popular. So now you can see the finalized version of the logo. And if you didn't know, Collier County has all of Florida's native water lily species represented in the wild for our county. So it's a very appropriate choice for our chapter logo, and we hope everybody likes it. Okay, then back at the beginning of the year, when we set our schedule, we decided that we would have a programming break in July. And mostly that's because we try to meet the first Wednesday of the month. And in July, that's very close to the holiday, the 4th of July. So we won't have a program in July. But we wish everybody a fun and safe 4th of July, whatever that brings for you. And then finally, just looking at my notes here. For members, this Saturday, there is an online statewide members meeting. So that's this Saturday, June 6th at 10:30 in the morning. And this is the annual members meeting that would have happened at the conference that was scheduled for mid-May in Jacksonville. But at the state level, the staff and the board members as well will give you some updates about the society. And there will be an opportunity to vote in some new board members at the state level. And I'm one of them. I'm up for a director at large position for the state level. So if you do attend on Saturday, you'll have the opportunity to vote me in at the state level, but don't worry, I'll still be serving as the Naples chapter president as well. Okay. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Chad Washburn is the Vice President of Conservation for Naples Botanical Garden. And he has worked at the Botanical Garden for over 13 years now, which is longer than the gardens as we know them have existed. So that's pretty amazing. And Chad is also a past president of the Naples chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. So at this time, I'll go ahead and make you the host, correct, Chad?
Yes, yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing first and then I'll make you the host. And then we'll get to see Chad's presentation.
All right. Can everybody see that? All right.
Yes, good.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. As Andy said, I'm Chad Washburn. I'm the Vice President of Conservation at Naples Botanical Garden, and I am a past president of the Native Plant Society and a very passionate proponent for native plants. Sorry, I'm getting my slides to move. Real quick, before we start, I just want to say that I'd like to note that your interest and advocacy for native plants is really vital to sustainable life here in Southwest Florida, and I just want to thank you for being here for that. We often work to promote native plants for their role in an ecosystem, and quite often that's related to pollinators or other wildlife. But tonight, I kind of want to challenge you to look at things a little bit differently. Tonight's presentation will cover some other ecosystem functions that we don't often consider when we have conversations about the importance of native plants. So tonight we're going to focus on stormwater ponds, and there's a reason for that. Collier County has over 8,200 stormwater ponds. That represents a significant opportunity for us, the Naples chapter, and for proponents of native plants to use the function of native plants to help clean our water. And we all know with red tide and blue-green algal blooms, that's something that's vital to life in our community. So first, what I'd like to do is define the area where plants grow in a stormwater pond, and that is the littoral zone. Sometimes you hear it pronounced littoral or littoral. Either one works appropriately. So this is the transitional area between the upland and the open water. And for the purpose of this program tonight, we're going to talk about the plantings in this area, but we'll also include an upland buffer planting on the dry upland side. So really we can break a littoral zone down into three different areas. There is the emergent zone, and that's this section here. And that's where there are plants that are growing rooted in water, and water levels can range from inundated to flooded, depending on the water fluctuating level. So the water just at the soil surface or water deeper than that. There's a transitional zone where plants are growing rooted in water, but depending on fluctuating water levels, they can be out of the water quite a bit of time. This area really varies in width. And then we have an upland buffer. So this is the area where the plants are growing out of the water, and this goes way, buffer zones can be quite wide, and they're typically the upland area around the outside edge of the stormwater pond. So I want to look at the different, brief look at the different functions and values that native littoral plantings have and why they're important to the overall health and efficiency of a stormwater system. So some of these may be things that you've considered before, but some of them may be new, or you might not quite fully, it took me a long time to fully grasp the importance of some of this littoral buffer zone around lakes and why it's so important. So they provide food and habitat for fish and wildlife. They can improve the aesthetics and increase property values, control erosion and stabilize shorelines. They can act as a buffer between the uplands and the open water. And perhaps most importantly, they can remove, prevent, and sequester pollutants that may be going into a stormwater pond. So we'll take a look at each of these and talk about each one a little bit more in depth. So littorals, and especially those emergent plants, provide habitat for aquatic invertebrates and small fish, so small insects and fish. And that's really the bottom of the food chain, and that contributes to healthy fish populations, which goes all the way up into providing food for wading birds. Just kind of an example of how important a healthy littoral zone is for a pond. As we built our ponds at the garden, we have a fantastic stormwater system, very lush, dense plantings around our lakes and ponds. And those areas have become one of the best places to see birds in the garden. I didn't check today, but we're typically ranked one of the top 3 or 4 birding locations in Collier County, which is pretty spectacular. And that's on eBird. If you're not familiar with eBird, it's a great resource. This picture, this is taken just a few days ago in Naples, just before really the rains started, in earnest. So littoral plantings can drastically alter the look of a stormwater pond and increase property values, especially in a situation like this one. So this picture was taken very recently, and it's what many of our ponds look like before the rainy season begins. I like to call this ring around the tub because you get this brown ring of mud all the way around the stormwater pond. And in many, but not all cases, we can use littoral plants, native plants, to help hide the banks in this low water situation. Some areas where you have a really extreme ring around the tub, it can be a challenge, but I think even in a situation like this, plants could be used to hide this. And for property values, that's really significant. In a pond like this one, one of the other issues is this fountain. So the fountain kind of exacerbates the problem of water loss because it's spraying water into the air, and then you getting higher evaporation of the water, and that's causing the water levels to decrease more rapidly during the dry season. So this pond will come up quite a bit during the wet season, but remember, Florida is a state that has a lot of people who are here seasonally, and they're here when this pond is dry and looks like this. So that aesthetics can be one important function that native plants can perform around a stormwater pond. Littoral plants can also help to control erosion and stabilize shorelines. So we see this in many of our ponds where the shoreline is not stable, where you have a slope going down into the pond. And you get this sloughing off, this edge where the soil sloughs off into the pond. This is often a consideration where grass carp have been used in ponds to control algae. They're eating the plants that are trying to establish in this area. A lot of times you have other fish that are trying to build nests along the edge. They will make these kind of cavities, and it slowly over time you get this erosion. So littoral plants can help this by both holding the soil along the edge of a stormwater pond in place. They also do something that you don't really think about. We think about the root structure holding that soil from eroding into the pond. The other thing they do is they prevent internal erosion. So on many of our ponds on a windy day, you'll get waves, and it can be waves that are just 2 or 3 inches, but that continual wave action on a windy day, it slowly helps to erode the pond internally and erode those banks. When that happens, it stirs up the sediments, and it actually gets nutrients that are trapped in those sediments suspended back into the water column. So this not only helps hold that bank in place, but it also helps with excess nutrients in the pond. So both littorals and the upland buffer can act as a barrier between the uplands and open water. I took this picture. This is in my own neighborhood, my own community. There's a buffer planting here. If we planted littorals on this pond, this is turf right down to the edge. But if we planted a buffer zone, we can prevent grass clippings and leaf litter from going into the pond. So when this area is mowed all the way around the lake, all of the grass clippings can be blown into the lake, and quite often are. I've been out and seen many ponds around South Florida where turf grass clippings go into the water. Well, as those decompose, they remove oxygen from the water, which can cause algal blooms. It can be a significant contributor to algal blooms, and can cause internal phosphorus loading, where phosphorus that's trapped in the sediments is released. That's what leads to major algal blooms. I think we'll cover that a little bit more in a moment in a future slide. Littoral plants also impact nutrient, pollutant, and sedimentation in ponds. They can slow the flow of water, causing a settling of sediments and pollutants. This is important in ponds, but it's also important in conveyances. So ditches, anywhere where water is moving. If the plants aren't there and water moves fast, it can carry large pieces of sediment and organic matter with it. What we really want to do with plants is cause the water to slow down. That longer that water is in one spot and the slower that it is, it allows the sediments to precipitate out. And those sediments typically are where your pollutants, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, any other heavy metals, anything like that would be. They can also dampen wave energy, and we mentioned this on the last slide, within a pond, so that prevents erosion and resuspension of the sediment pollutants. They also, a function that we quite often point to as one of the major functions, I think it's important, is they also uptake pollutants, especially nutrients within the pond. If you have plantings of plants around, littoral plants around the edges, their roots are in that water, so they're helping to bind especially the nutrients, and then they keep them in the organic matter in those native plants. And as I mentioned earlier, a wide buffer zone of littoral plants around a pond can prevent grass clippings and other organic matter from entering the pond. So just as an example, I want to share with you where we have native plants at Naples Botanical Garden, where we use the function of native plants to improve water quality on our site. So I'm going to take you on a journey of a drop of water that falls on the parking lot at the Botanical Garden, and through each of the different ecosystems that we use, that we've created using native plants to treat and remove pollutants from the water. As you pull into the garden, this is the main driveway pulling into the garden, and here's where you park, just to kind of give you a frame of reference. And then this is the main entrance to the garden. So as a drop of water lands on our parking lot, you'll notice our parking lot doesn't have big grates on it. We're a botanical garden. Plants are the most important thing they're at the heart of everything that we do. So we wanted to put plants right out front to treat that water. Instead of putting it in a pipe and moving it quickly somewhere, we can treat that water. So a drop of water that falls on our parking lot will, as the parking lot drains, it goes into these bioswales. And next time you come to the garden, I recommend, as you pull your car up, look over the edge of that. Where you pull your car up to is a bioswale. These are planted with native Florida plants. We designed these looking at Florida ecosystems. So we looked for Florida ecosystems that have fluctuating water levels, So during the rainy season, they have inundation or flooding. And during the dry season, areas that get water levels draw down. So we have some cabbage palms, some grasses. There's a few trees in this area. It's planted with plants that can take that alternating cycles of wet and dry. So it takes quite a bit of rainfall. Most of the water that goes into this stays in this bioswale. It takes quite a bit of rainfall for water to get high enough to flow out of the drain into the next section of this. So most of the water from our parking lot is treated by native plants in this area, or it goes into groundwater recharge, which is really the most important way to clean up water. When it does get high enough, it goes through a drain and into a pipe underground to the rain garden. So this is the main wetland at the entrance to the garden. There's two sections there. The front section is a pond that's isolated. We have non-native water lilies in there. We do not put anything that's not native in our bodies of water that are connected to natural areas. We only plant native plants in those because we want to keep them. We don't want to run the risk of getting invasive species or non-native species into our stormwater system. So you'll see a stormwater pond there. It's at the entrance to a botanical garden. Think about that. That to me is really fascinating. Typically with stormwater, next time you can get out and go to a store, look for where their stormwater goes. Go to a big box store, quite often there's a mown grass bowl in the back with pipes, and water goes in and is piped right back out, or it's an area where they mow, it's turf grass. That's really not plants performing ecological function. That's actually can be a system that adds pollutants to our stormwater system. We put it right out front. I always like to say this, we've made stormwater sexy. It's the first thing you see when you pull into the garden. That stormwater wetland that's there, again, was designed using native plants. We looked actually at Clyde Butcher prints to see what a native ecosystem. We wanted both function and design. So we looked at some of his photos when we designed that area. Oops. So from there, water flows into Harvey's Lake underground once that wetland fills up to a certain point. And Harvey's Lake is not real, it's kind of outside of the public area of the garden, but it's our main irrigation source on the site. We want the water going into that lake to be as clean as possible. So we use this system to clean the water so that when it goes in, it doesn't have all of those pollutants. They've settled out as much as we can get them to. So that's Harvey's Lake, and the water stays in Harvey's Lake for quite some time. Eventually, when it reaches full stage, water does leave Harvey's Lake through a pipe that is underground, and it pops up right down here at the head of the River of Grass. So here's the water garden, the beautiful water garden with all of the water lilies. And here's the performance lawn where you may have seen a concert or seen performances at the garden. This is disconnected from this. This area is the River of Grass. So it's the main, it's the backbone of the garden. And it's planted with native plants that are performing this important ecological function of cleaning water. Again, I think that is so awesome that as a botanical garden, we've got this little miniature Everglades that is cleaning water. And if you, next time you're there, walk through that and you might see it a little bit differently. You're walking over a stormwater pond. We've made it an important feature on the landscape. That always fascinates me. So we do every once in a while get wildlife in that area. We have had reports of bobcats that have snuck in from the preserve and hung out in the River of Grass all afternoon while the garden is open. So the water flows through this native Everglades planting in our River of Grass, goes out the mouth of that into our lakes. We have a significant lake system. And then once it's in those lakes, it really stays in those lakes for a long time. That's called residence time. And we don't know what the residence time of those lakes is. That's how long a drop of water would stay in that lake before it overflows. But we think it's on the matter of years, on the order of years. So once that water is in that lake for so long being treated, Once that lake level does get high enough, that water will flow out and it goes into our south wetlands. So for a journey for a drop of water, it's going through 5 created wetland systems planted with native plants before it even gets out into our restored wetland area. So it's being cleaned about as thoroughly as we can make it happen. So we talked about the importance of native plants and the function of native plants, hopefully in a different way than what we typically think of the function of native plants, those pollinator, big importance for pollinators. So now I want to talk about the plant palette. What are some of the plants that we can use in these stormwater ponds? I'll talk a little bit about, I curated a little bit and picked out some of my favorites. So we'll talk about those, and then where you would use them. This is not by any means the entire list, but we'll talk about those, and at the end we'll open up for questions and have an opportunity to learn more about this. So dwarf Fakahatchee grass, Tripsicum floridanum. There are actually 2 species of Fakahatchee grass that are native to South Florida. One is Fakahatchee grass, the other is dwarf Fakahatchee grass. One of my favorite things, there is a nursery in town that sells this as half-a-hatchee grass, which is kind of a name that they made up, but I like it. So as you can imagine by the name, dwarf Fakahatchee grass is much shorter in stature than Fakahatchee grass. This is something that you would plant on the upland banks and buffers in masses. You can plant it in large areas. This grows to about 2 to 3 foot tall, but it does send up a flower spike that can get to about 4 feet. The flowers are sparse and they don't block views. So if you have a buffer zone at the top of the hill, a lot of people are worried that plants will block the view of their pond. Really, next time you go to the garden, we plant areas where we want to preserve key view sheds. We don't put as wide of a buffer. So those plants are sloped downhill. So really, they're not tall enough to block your view of the water. So this is one that grows in moist soils, but it's really highly drought tolerant. And it's a really fantastic plant for banks and buffers. Another one, this is one of my favorites. This is sand cordgrass, or Spartina bakeri. This is one that you would plant in masses on upland buffers and pond banks. This gets to about 3 foot tall, and it's a clumping grass, and it can grow to about 4 to 5 foot wide. This one likes moist soils, but it is tolerant of periods of drought. So we've got 2 grasses, one with a very narrow blade, the sand cordgrass, and one with a very wide blade, the dwarf Fakahatchee grass. So those 2 mixed together can really, they're really both grasses with ornamental qualities. It can be very attractive. Another one that's related to sand cordgrass is marsh hay cordgrass. This is very similar to sand cordgrass, except for this is a runner. It's not a clumping grass. So this is one we put on the lower edge, a little closer to the water. It starts out as a clumping grass. You'll plant it as a clump, but then over time as it grows, it becomes a runner. And this fills in and becomes very lush and dense. It runs across an area. It's not invasive, but it will really fill in that area just around close to the high water mark. And what we like to do with these grasses is plant them a little bit high, or with any of these plants, plant them a little bit high and let them grow into the water. If you plant it a little bit higher, typically these plants are coming out of a nursery where they've been growing in upland conditions and just well watered. So you don't want to drown it. It's something that you would plant a little bit high, and as it grows, it's going to grow out into the water. So this gets about 2 to 3 foot tall, and it can be about 4 foot when it's in flower. So we've got 3 grasses that kind of cover the buffer zone and the upper zone, and then we get into that transitional zone where this marsh hay cordgrass would be planted. We need something ornamental for this. So we've got one of my favorite grasses. This is pink muley grass. And I love this. This is one that if you drive across Tamiami Trail, especially in the fall, this blooms especially heavily in the fall. And especially if you drive across early morning or late in the day, it looks like the landscape is on fire. This beautiful, bright pink grass with the sun behind it. It's absolutely spectacular. It does bloom periodically in the summer and winter months, but like I said, the most heavy bloom is in the fall. Beautiful pink flowers to it. It's a gorgeous plant. This is a really beautiful example of this plant. It can, after it blooms, get a little bit shaggy looking. It holds on to some of those flower heads. The plant doesn't look as beautiful and green and lush. It seeds in around places, not really heavily, but it does drop seeds and grow from seeds. So you get smaller plants when it doesn't have as much room to grow in between other things. So what we like to do at the Botanical Garden, we use about 20% pink muley grass in a planting with those 3 other grasses. So you mix it in areas. And this is one that, you know, like I said, mix about 20% in, but put this in an area, in a highly visible area. It really is spectacular, and at different times of the year can give you some great color. This was the Garden Club of America's Plant of the Year a few years ago, and that's nationwide. It grows all the way up the east coast of the United States. But interestingly, as you get further up the eastern coast of the United States, further north, this plant doesn't like any water. It likes really dry conditions. I worked at a garden in Pennsylvania, and they planted this on a hill and rock because too much water would kill it. Here in South Florida, it likes to have its roots in water. It loves wet feet, but it will take dry conditions. So now we're going to move on more towards the emergent planting zone, where the plants are inundated with water or flooded for much of the year. So I'm going to recommend 2 spike rushes, and the 2 look very similar. They perform very similarly, but as native plant people, we all know that diversity is key. If the water becomes a little bit more brackish, one of these 2 takes water a little bit more brackish. They both perform very similarly, but you have that added benefit of having more genetic diversity and more resiliency. This goes to about 2 to 3 foot tall out of the water. However, it can grow deeper into the water. I've seen it underwater quite deep, but emerging about 2 to 3 feet. This grows in wide bands, and this is really one of those plants, along with that sand or the cordgrass, that can help cover that ring around the tub. This is a plant that you want to plant higher. You plant it so that its roots, again, are in the water, and it's going to grow out into the water. And it's going to vary in width year to year, depending on your water levels. This is the other spike rush, knotted spike rush, Elaeacris cellulosa. So again, we have Elaeacris interstincta and Elaeacris cellulosa as our two spike rushes. Those are really solid performing plants. Unless you have a really shallow, narrow pond, they are not going to take over your pond. I've heard a few people concerned about that, but I've not seen that as an issue. These really form a healthy band around the pond. So we've got our high performing plants. And again, this is just a short list of a few selections. I want to pick out some other things that can be added as accent plants. They can provide some color and some different forms than some of those just grasses through flowers or broader leaves. So they provide some visual impact. And for the greatest impact, we like to plant these in masses, in clumps. And they'll spread a little bit, and you'll get a really nice visual, like for this one, a nice tropical broadleaf. Duck potato, or Sagittaria latifolia, has very attractive white flowers with yellow centers. Like I said, tropical looking broad leaves. This goes to about 2 to 3 foot tall and spreads rapidly. It does best in organic soils. So if your pond is brand new, it's one. If it's a newly dug pond, it may not have organic soil, so this can take a little bit to get established. However, if it is in an area with nice organic soils and a pond that's been around for a while, this one can do quite well. Lanceleaf arrowhead, another relative, Sagittaria lancifolia. We have this in our river of grass at the garden, and we've been managing against a giant bulrush in that river of grass. And when we treated the giant bulrush, it was too big of a plant. It got out of scale. This lanceleaf arrowhead took over. So right now, if you next time you come into the garden, nearly the entire river of grass is this lanceleaf arrowhead, Sagittaria lancifolia. Again, grows to about 2 to 3 feet, spreads pretty rapidly, and it does best in organic soils. If you're a history buff, the Sagittarias were the roots of these duck potatoes were eaten by the Lewis and Clark expedition as they went across the United States. So these were subsistence food for them to help them across the Bitterroot Mountains. This is a great one. Crinum Americanum, or swamp lily. This goes to about 2 to 3 foot tall. However, it's not something that you're going to even see really well until it flowers. And then you'll get this beautiful white flower. And again, as you drive across Tamiami Trail 41, you can see this when it's in full bloom on the sides of the road. You can see these pops of white in the distance. These beautiful white masses of intensely fragrant flowers. And these are ones that I would not plant in a clump. I would plant these scattered throughout the emergent areas. And the reason for that is they attract lubber grasshoppers, which devour the leaves. And if they're all planted in one spot, that's really just a smorgasbord for those giant, brightly colored grasshoppers. So we kind of spread these out. And this is big enough, the flowers are big enough that you'll see them from a distance. And like some of the other accent plants that I've covered, these do best in organic soils. Another one that we see that sometimes we've had it do beautifully and take off, a former president of this chapter of the Native Plant Society, Dwayne Repp, had these in his stormwater pond. And they covered the entire bank of his stormwater pond. It was beautiful. And when it bloomed, it was this incredible mass of these purple irises. Much like the swamp lily, this is a plant you won't see until it's in bloom. This is one that I would plant in masses, and they typically bloom in the spring when all of our snowbirds are typically here. So this is a great one. And again, this one likes organic soils. So that's a selection of some of the more herbaceous plants. I'll go over just a couple trees that you might include. Buttonwood. We often think of this as a plant that grows in the mangroves, but it's used as street trees in areas around the world. I've seen photos of these in India, used as significant street trees in areas. They can take quite a bit of drought, and they can take inundated conditions. They're very attractive, and they're a great host for epiphytes. These can be maintained as trees or shrubs. Bald cypress, of course, inundated to flooding conditions. This is a really architectural plant, and yes, it will, like its name, bald cypress, it will lose its leaflets, so it goes bald during the dry season when many of our snowbirds are here. But even that architectural form can really be fantastic. Also have that tall, narrow shape, and that helps to break up the horizontal shoreline. And this is something that I would not plant in front of someone's house. I would plant it more in the long view sheds, maybe in front of on a stormwater pond that has a preserve behind it. Another great one, and we see these as street trees, however, it likes wet feet and organic soils, is Dehoon Holly. These fruits can range from red to orange to yellow, so you can get them in different colors. And the trees are male or female, so it's the female trees that produce the fruit. This can add a really nice pop of color around your pond. Another good one, magnolias, the Sweet Bay Magnolia, Magnolia virginiana. This is not a big, lush, tropical-looking plant. They can be a little bit scraggly, especially if they're grown in really shade conditions. But out on their own, it can in more sun, it can be a beautiful small tree. It gets these beautiful white flowers though and has attractive silvery foliage. Notice we've changed sides here. So the description is on the other side. And I did that for a reason. So there are a few native plant species that we see on all of the lists. And this is why I'm not a fan of lists. I don't like to hand out lists. Quite often, many of the lists that are out there don't paint the full picture. This is a fantastic plant. However, I would avoid it in a stormwater pond or use it sparingly for a couple different reasons. Pickerel weed tends to go dormant during the dry season. So I've seen a few areas where thousands of these were planted, and then water levels dropped when our visitors came back during the winter season, and the ground was bare. These are also really highly variable in form across the state. It's really genetically plastic. So a plant that's collected in Collier County versus Lee County is going to behave and perform differently and actually look very different. They can have much broader leaves, flower at different times. They're really highly variable. And there was a professor at UF, Dr. Michael Kane, who did some work on this. And it was amazing how much variation there was across the state. I know he's presented that at the state level with the Native Plant Society. Another plant that's on every plant list I see is Alligator Flag, Thalia geniculata. And this is a red form of Thalia. This, again, goes dormant during the dry season, has a tendency to go dormant during the dry season. So they have this big foliage that turns brown when people are here. So really not something that we want to include. Another one that I'm not a huge fan of is yellow canna for those same reasons. It can go dormant during the dry season and not completely. These all don't go completely dormant, but they go, they're semi-dormant. And caterpillars eat the leaves on this one. Caterpillars are not a bad thing. We want more caterpillars, but they can do some significant damage to them. And, it's kind of a balance there. We want caterpillars to feed the birds, but this is a plant I wouldn't recommend, not necessarily because of caterpillars, but because of that dormancy. I think the last plant that I've got that I necessarily wouldn't recommend is giant bulrush. This used to be Scirpus, and there's a couple different Scirpus. They've just changed the genus to Chenoplectus. This gets as tall as 9 feet. As a homeowner, I would not be happy if something that was 9 feet was planted in front of my house. It's very aggressive. It provides great seed for birds. It is a high-functioning plant. This is something that's really holding the sediment. It's really uptaking nutrients. Only downside is that we're balancing their function here with their aesthetic appeal to homeowners. Most of these stormwater ponds have homes planted around, or homes around them. So we don't want to plant something that is going to upset the community. So all of this that I've presented is just kind of the very beginning of this. If you're interested in learning more, and I can put this link in the chat at the end, we've partnered with Rookery Bay and the Collier County Pollution Control to offer a 2-day workshop. It's 2 hours per day of presentations based on best practices for stormwater ponds. And the presentation that I do for that is much greater. If you live in an HOA or you have a community association manager, a board member that you're interested in getting them to plant literal plants around your pond, getting them to plant native plants in your community, this class is a great first step. We talk about why it's important, what plants to plant, how to manage those plants over time. Really, we're trying to do this in a way that gives them all of the tools that they might need to do this and be successful. So with that, I'll put a link to this in the chat, and I think that ends my presentation.
Thank you so much, Chad. It's a really important topic, really great presentation. I'm going to take a look at the chat, see if we've got any questions. I'm not seeing any on my end so far. So let's give people a few minutes to put in a question if they have any. And I know that, um, Chad, you've been giving a version of this presentation for many years now. I remember when I started at the garden back in 2013, maybe even before, you had a version of this presentation. And over the last couple of years, there's been so much focus on the water quality in Southwest Florida. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if over time you've noticed an increase in requests for this kind of information.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So this is something that we've had a lot of interest in for years at the Botanical Garden. And for a long time, we were going out into the community and helping people looking at their ponds. We really realized that we were helping some homeowners who then would ask us to come back and speak to the HOA or the community association manager or the landscape board. And then we were going back to talk to a company on what the HOA wanted and helping to design these. And we really decided that we needed to take a more holistic approach. So we've started offering this program to a much broader audience and directed. We're doing one for landscape architects. We're doing one for the companies that manage stormwater ponds, for HOAs and community association managers. We're really taking a much bigger picture approach. Interestingly enough, our most popular tour at the Botanical Garden now is our stormwater tour. We've had politicians from across the state, when they're in town, come and actually take that tour. We've hosted the Blue-Green Algae Task Force at the state level on that tour, and the South Florida Water Management District. So it's been really popular. Big topic with blue-green algae and red tide.
Are you able to see the questions?
Yeah. So let me go back up. I'll take these in order. So Beth's question is, we have lots of muley grass and it was looking old and brown, so we cut it way back. Is this okay to do every few years? Yes, Beth, absolutely. That's okay to do every few years. A lot of times landscape companies will cut grasses back, and what they're doing is mimicking fire and removing thatch, and the grass comes back nice and green. However, what happens over a number of years, it gets cut back to 6 inches or so, and it actually makes more thatch at the base. So if you're only doing this every few years, that's absolutely a really good way of renewing your muley grass. We do this in a few areas around the garden, but we mostly leave them go for quite some time. So great question. Okay, from Andrew Tyler. You mentioned that fountains tend to evaporate the pond water. Do you see any value in terms of algal reduction through the oxygenation of the water? Thank you. Actually, we see much better value. So I mentioned when we get grasses and organic matter in ponds, leaf litter, it decomposes and removes oxygen. That causes phosphorus that's in the sediments to be released and can cause an algal bloom. So grass going into a pond can cause an algal bloom. If you can keep oxygen throughout the water column, you can reduce that. A fountain does not really tend to add much aeration. We use bubblers at the garden, and they draw from deep in the pond, and actually deep lower where there's less oxygen, and it bubbles air up through that. So those help, and they don't have that added effect of water loss through evaporation. You also want to be careful. If you have ducks in your pond and you're spraying the water into the air, you're spraying a lot more than just water into the air. It can not be, I always am concerned for human health when I see that. Let's see. Thank you, Leslie, for the note. I appreciate that. Bonnie, thank you. Diane. Diane wanted to know about invasive plants and invasive plants in the littoral zone. So a couple of, that's a great question. A couple of the non-native or invasive plants or aggressive plants that we tend to get in our littoral zones, one of the biggest ones is torpedo grass. It is a grass that loves wet areas, and it can grow in a mat on the surface of the water and grow out quite a ways. Lake Okeechobee is dealing with this continually. It takes over the native plantings and outcompetes them. Many of our invasive plants, they thrive on disturbance and nutrients. Many of them can use nutrients much more efficiently. Cattail, for example. Cattails use nutrients much more efficiently than some of our native plants. So a pond that has high nutrient levels in it is going to have much more rapid cattail growth. So you're going to have to outcompete against those. Cattails can be native to this region. However, there's 3 species of cattails that have hybridized, and now they've become aggressive. We get hybrid vigor, and that's a whole nother story. But really the way to deal with invasive plants is really jump on them as quickly as possible and spend the budget in the beginning. The longer you wait to treat invasive plants, the more costly it will be in the end. So. Okay, another question from Judy. Is it necessary to thin out the rushes along the edge of a pond? Ours seem to be filling in the ponds. So those 2 rushes, I've talked to a few people that are concerned with how wide that band of rushes goes. As the water levels come up during the rainy season, that should be a little bit more narrower. Unless your pond is really shallow, they shouldn't go too much deeper. I need to get out and start looking at some of the ponds that have concerns with rushes, but I've not seen a pond in Collier County that had rushes growing all the way across it. So that's something that I need to spend more time with for sure, Judy. From Karen, as a former permit reviewer for the state, I also recommend that HOAs remember to do routine maintenance on the structures, the engineering side of stormwater ponds, to help them function over time. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for making that comment, because the structures that she's talking about are your outflows, your drainage ways. I reviewed one set of stormwater ponds in Naples that their water was turning brown and from tannins, and they could not figure out why. The trees that they had on the street were black olives, which is a native tree, but the entire community was lined with black olives. Black olives tend to stain water. They have high tannins in the leaves. The landscape companies were actually blowing the leaves into the drains on the streets, we found, and those were going into the pond and causing significant issues. So now when those drop their leaves, they actually have a street sweeper come through, and it saved them thousands of dollars in pond maintenance, because they don't have that organic matter going into their ponds. So actually, absolutely important too during hurricane season. Get out there and make sure someone in your HOA is monitoring those structures. So thank you, Karen. And from Bonnie, would your comments about cutting back mule grass hold true for us up in Tallahassee? Yeah, I would say same for up in Tallahassee. It's okay to renewal prune those grasses periodically. I just wouldn't do it all the time. I think doing it too much weakens them over a number of years. There's too much thatch. Fire doesn't, like I said, it's mimicking fire, and when fire comes through, it burns it off down to the ground, down to the tiller, so you don't get that thatch buildup. So just a real quick note on trimming grasses. Best thing to do about trimming grasses is when you cut that, so you have a 4-foot wide clump of spartina. If you renewal prune a few of those and you trim that, you're removing something that is outcompeting weeds. This goes back to Diane's question. Then you have to watch really closely, because weeds can germinate in that gap, in that sunlight. So what you want to do is cut that grass off and spread it around the plant as a mulch. So you're adding to the organic matter in the soil. You're helping to prevent weeds. So it really is putting that back into the system. that grass that's up there, unless it's really fine, and then if it's got plants below it, it's not going to go into the stormwater system. What are the other planting benefits from renewal pruning? We do sometimes at the garden renewal prune some of our shrubs, especially hedges. It can help push new growth, and some things bloom on new growth, so it's good. Firebush is one that we will renewal prune. Usually towards the end of a year, they can get leggy, they can get some different scale insects, so we'll do that for renewing them. One of the things I don't recommend is a lot of times someone renewal prunes something and feels like, okay, grow quickly, put fertilizer on it, make it grow. That's not really the case. I wouldn't cut something and then add a bunch of fertilizer. It's going to take a little bit for that plant to start growing and taking up that fertilizer. And again, if it's healthy and you've renewal pruned it like that, let it come back and see what it looks like. Don't put any fertilizer in your littoral plantings or in your buffer zones. Keep the fertilizer away from our water and follow all of the fertilizing regulations.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chad. So much valuable information, lots of great questions. So you can tell that everybody who attended live tonight was very interested in this topic. So
awesome.
Really, thank you for taking the time to talk to our chapter tonight.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, everybody. Thank you. It was a great opportunity. I love the opportunity to do this. So one last time, I dropped in the chat the link to the best practices for lakes and ponds in your community. And that's aimed again at homeowners associations, community association managers, board members, homeowners, anybody in your community. So thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and reclaim host.
All right.
I'm the host again.
All right.
So just bringing the meeting to a close. Just one more reminder, a couple things I said at the beginning of the meeting, that we will not have a program in July. It's just a planned break for our chapter. But I'll still send out a newsletter in July to let everybody know the programs that will be coming up in August and into the future. For the foreseeable future, we'll continue having online meetings. And also for members, don't forget there's the annual members meeting online this Saturday at 10:30. And you should have gotten an email with the link to join that meeting. So that's all I have. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you again, Chad. And everybody have a great night.